Okay, so we are recording. That means that when we post this on the STRAC webpage, people at home will be able to watch at their leisure, hear the discussion just like they would in a regular STRAC meeting. And then at the end, if they have comments that they'd like to be shared publicly, they can submit those to our short-term rental inbox, str@denvergov.org. We'll repeat that at the end so that when they're watching, they can have that handy. And then if they'd like to have those comments posted on our STRAC site, they can have that, they can indicate that, and we'll post them so that people can hear them and read them just like they would at the end of a normal STRAC meeting. So what I'm going to do next is I'm going to share my screen so that you all can see the slides. And then you should all be seeing that right now. A couple other things to keep in mind, like I mentioned, if you could keep your microphone muted until and unless you have to talk, that will help us prevent an echo on the recording. You'll also notice that there's a chat feature if you're using the app. We ask that if you use that at all, please only use it to indicate that you have a comment or a question. I know sometimes with these virtual meetings, it can be hard to see who wants to talk or who's trying to speak because we can't see each other's faces as well as we normally do. So if you're having trouble, feel free to either use that chat, or if you're on your phone or it's too difficult, you can also email me and let me know that you'd like to make a comment. Otherwise, we're going to try to keep it as natural as possible given the virtual setting. So just like in a normal meeting, if you want to use the raise your hand feature, or just cut in and say, hey, Erica, this is so-and-so, I've got a question on that. Just let me know, and we'll make sure that we try to have as natural a discussion as possible. So with that, I think what we'll do is we'll jump in. I've kind of listed everybody on the call, but like I said, if you would like to say something, please just introduce yourself first so that whoever is speaking can be identified for the record on the recording. Does anyone have any questions before we get started? Okay, great. With that, we will dive into our agenda. So can everyone see the slides? If not, say no. But the first thing that we'll start with are our licensing and enforcement data. So as those of you who've been to STRAC meetings know, we always talk about this data so that it helps us identify the issues and trends that we're seeing so that we can make sure that the solutions we're working on are always relevant. So with the licensing enforcement data update since April, what we've seen, here we go, is that we've seen an increase in our licensing rate. So that top number, that blue line with the little squares, our licensing rate is currently at 85%. That's the highest we've ever been since we started tracking this. You can see all the way back to January of last year, that's the highest licensing rate we've had. And unfortunately, this is a little bit due to what we assume is, the result of the coronavirus pandemic. But the things to keep in mind are, first of all, those little gray numbers at the bottom. They've been around 200 for the past 6 months or so. That hasn't changed. Those are short-term rental properties that haven't had any activity with host compliance for the past year. So they are kind of ones that we don't really count. They're kind of just advertisements that haven't been, or properties that haven't been advertised or booked or used. The green bars show the number of short-term rental licenses that we've had. We have seen a slight decrease in that number. At the beginning of the year, we were around 2,700, and you can see that's been pretty consistent over the past year or so. However, we've seen a slight decrease with people seeking licenses, probably due to the statewide order that prohibited people from operating short-term rentals there for a while. People trying to save money on licensure fees, things like that. That's what we anticipate, or what we expect that number decline is. So we saw 2381 active licenses for June of this month. Then that light gray number is the number of unique short-term rental properties identified by host compliance. That's where we've seen the biggest decrease. Those are the total number of unique properties being advertised on platforms such as Airbnb, VRBO, etc. At the beginning of the year, we had about 3,600 unique properties being advertised, and that's come down to about 2,787, bringing that gap between the number of licenses that we have and the number of properties being advertised much closer. So that's how we get the 85% licensure rate. As you can see in the chart below, that's a 20% decrease from where we were this time last year. From June of 2019 to June of 2020. Again, we anticipate that this is mostly due to the coronavirus, but we haven't heard any evidence to indicate otherwise. So the next slide is a little bit new. So we've in the past talked about data and trends on the calls that we receive from 311 requesting information about short-term rental calls. So if those of you who've been on the committee for a while remember, we used to just have a list of categories with numbers tracking the different categories. However, we identified that some of the categories overlapped and that the charts were not telling us information about trends and the percentage of calls that were geared toward different categories or not. So this here's the raw data showing the different categories. As you can see, in January and February of this year, we were still collecting that data in the old system, but in March we switched over to the new 311 issue templates and notification system for the hosts who would receive violations and whatnot. So with our 311 complaint system notification and call overhaul, we started shifting in March toward the new way of collecting data. So that's why the colors are a little bit different from month to month. This slide, however, shows kind of the big categories based on topic rather than individual calls. So I thought this was interesting to share and more helpful than our old chart, because you can see on the left we've got a chart that shows information from 2019, and on the right you've got the 2020 year-to-date data. So I've lumped a couple of the categories together for purposes of comparison, showing that, the chunk of calls that we're getting out of our total, what topics are they covering? What are people calling the city about when they asking about short-term rentals? So a big chunk last year was they had either received a notice of violation, letting them know that they were out of compliance, or they received an administrative citation, and they were calling to either ask about or pay that administrative citation. That was 30% of the total calls we received last year. Year to date, that's only 18% of what we're seeing. So that's a slight decrease, although over the course of the year that may change. Last year, about a third of the calls we received were just inquiries about how do I apply? I'm missing something from my application and I'm calling because I need to submit it. I'm trying to renew. So all questions related to applications and renewals. These are the hosts calling with questions. How do I use the online platform? Things like that. We've seen a significant decrease this year, only at 23% of our total calls, because again, we saw that drop in licenses. We saw, if you looked in the April packet that was sent out with the update, you noticed that we were receiving far fewer applications than we typically receive on a weekly basis. So again, related to the pandemic, but we did see a decrease there. Those decreases, though, have moved over into our inquiries and general questions. That is the bulk of the calls that we're receiving this year as compared with last year. Some examples include, can I operate my short-term rental under the governor's stay-at-home order or safer-at-home order? If so, what does this mean for me? Do you have any resources? Questions like that. We've seen a big uptick in those. The one category that we've pulled out, and this is the one that I think that the committee had been interested in the past, is the property complaints. So that was 15% of our total calls last year. It's at around 17% of our calls this year. This encompasses any complaints about trash, noise from guests, primary residence complaints, all of that is accompanied here. So moving forward, what we'd like to do is provide a breakdown of those complaints and possibly breakdown of inquiries and questions if that's interesting to the committee, just to kind of dig a little deeper to see, again, when people call the city, what kinds of information are they seeking, and how can this committee ensure that we are crafting solutions and messaging and things that are supportive of the types of requests we're getting. So does anyone have any questions about the new 311 data measuring system or the complaint system? Great. Okay, I see David said that a detailed breakdown of complaints would be great. So good. We're excited to dig deeper into that. Basically, what we've done is we've sent some new training materials to the 311 call staffers who can better categorize the types of calls. So essentially the first level is figuring out which category of these 5 the questions fall into. And then the second level of questions would be, if it's property complaint, what type? Or if it's an application and renewal, which is it, a new license or a renewal, et cetera, et cetera. So we look forward to being able to share some more details as we collect the data in the new system. The next slide Brian usually does, but he is quite busy, as you all can imagine, overseeing our temporary patio expansion program to allow our restaurants in Denver expanded premises for patio dining. So he gave me these numbers. I don't have a lot of commentary to go with them. What I did notice when I was updating the slides is that we're increasing the numbers kind of on par with what we had last year. So of applications we received, those new and renewals, so far 257 have been withdrawn, 178 have been closed administratively, and 58 have been denied. I believe this is grand total, so this would build off of the information you got in the April update. Same with the number of affidavits. To date, we've sent a total of 614, and 271 have been returned, so that's almost half. Of the ones that have been returned, 154 of the licenses have been issued, so overwhelmingly what we're seeing is that when we do send the affidavit, most people return it, and of the people who return it, most receive their license. The last slide shows the number of licenses that we've show caused, so I think this is also important to keep in mind when we talk about enforcement. Since April of 2018, we have had 17 licenses show caused, and 15 of those resulted in either the license being revoked or the license holder surrendering that license. So very few of the about 3,000 licenses that we have been show caused for violating the law. So the next info is our tax revenue data. This is always a fun slide. So I think if Sophia's on the line, correct me if I get any of this wrong, but we have to date, or as of the end of April actually, we had 3,422 lodgers tax accounts in the city. And as of that date, we had 2,381 short-term rental business licenses. As all of you know, you need both of these things in order to be able to operate lawfully. So what we're still seeing is a difference of about 1,000 between people who have both, people who have the lodger's tax license and the short-term rental business license. So that's an area where we will continue to do education on both ends to ensure that people are getting both of the licenses they need before they operate. Year to date in 2020, we have collected about 2.9 million in lodger's tax, and so far that's 11% of the lodger's tax collected. As you can see, we had increasing totals of lodger's tax collected over the past 3 years, so it'll be interesting to see the effect of the pandemic on those numbers for the end of the year. I see a question from David and Daniel. David or Daniel, do you want to ask those questions of the group? And so it's not just me talking? Oops.
Yeah, this is just Dan. This is Dan. I was just curious what in that earlier slide, there were 50 some odd investigations going on. I just wondered, are they stuck? What happens to them? Do they get resolved quickly? How does that work?
Sure. So let me go back to the slide. Oops, that's not what I wanted to do. Forgive me. We'll get there. Bear with me. Okay. So you asked about the, sorry, can you repeat the question?
Sure. Under affidavits, it talks about what's happening to the returned affidavits, and 52 have an investigation pending. And I just wonder how long that goes on.
Sure. Caveat, I will not answer this question as detailed as Brian would, so I apologize in advance. But essentially what happens is that once the affidavit is returned, you know, then the staff in our office, our inspectors who do investigations will, you know, kind of investigate. Sometimes it's complaint-based. Most of the time it's complaint-based. Sometimes it's based on information that we receive from the applicant. So it's all dependent on the specific application and the specific complaint. So those could be anywhere along the process. They could be investigation. They could be filed with the city attorney's office. They could be actually being researched by another agency, for example, zoning or building, you know, for various reasons. So that's kind of the high level answer. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, I was just curious if they get stuck there, though. That was the thing, and I hear what you're saying, though.
Sure. Is Alex? If Alex is on the call, Alex, do you have any additional information that would kind of illuminate the process? Oh, we might not have Alex today.
Sorry, I wasn't muted. But typically what happens is once the inspector completes the investigation and report, it moves fairly quickly. Things are a lot slower right now since we're all sort of directed at our temporary expansions. So there might be more that are in the queue than usual.
Great, thanks, Alex. And then it looks like we had a question from David Pardo. So David, do you want to pitch your question next?
Yeah, ever since I've been on STRAC, there have always been more lodgers tax accounts than there have been STR licenses. And I was wondering if some of those lodgers tax accounts are attributable to other lodging facilities, or if like hotels and traditional bed and breakfasts and hostels and everything else that falls under lodging has some other type of like tax account, or if that might actually be a few hundred of those.
Thanks, David. I'll take that on. So lodgers tax is one tax, and it covers all sorts of facilities. But what we try to do when we analyze those numbers is we have an actual indicator for something that either the taxpayer or we have identified as a short-term rental. So it still has a lodgers tax account, but it has a flag as a short-term rental property versus a hotel or another facility. The issue with lodgers tax accounts is a lot of them are set up to file on an annual basis. So if they stop operating, but they don't notify us, you guys may not have a license for them, but we may have a license for them at the time, and they won't even tell us until they get a tax return in January of the next year. So There's some kind of back and forth there depending on what things are going on. But I mean, we had 324 new accounts opened, during 2020 so far. And what we do is we send that information to excise and license, and those short-term rentals are also supposed to give their lodger's tax number to their license. So we have lodger's tax accounts that potentially are categorized as a lodging license, but I have to, that's kind of a constant sure up on our end, but we're working on it. And I think there's also a conception that, if I need an account, but I file through, another licensed provider like HomeAway or Airbnb, then it can be a little bit trickier too in following those different indicators.
Thanks, Sophia. And so it could be the case then that some of the folks that have a lodger's tax account but not a short-term rental license are just not there in the process yet, because you have to get the tax license first.
Yes, that can also be part of the numbers.
Okay. Does that answer your question, David?
Yes.
Okay. It looks like Dana has a question next. So Dana, you want to go ahead? Dana, I can't hear you.
Okay, technical difficulties. Okay, hear me now? Good?
Yes.
Okay, so my question is on this topic as well. If the total number of lodging tax accounts, are all of that, is that total active tax accounts, or those just tax accounts that have been created?
Those are the number of active accounts presently that we have. And that can change on a daily basis if somebody decides to call in and close their account. But that is the active accounts through April 30th.
Okay, and maybe active wasn't the right word. I mean, if there is actual taxes accruing on these accounts versus an account that's been approved, I think, I've heard of people that are doing step one out of the 2 steps that don't actually end up filing for their license. Either they find out that their plans change, or maybe they don't actually fall exactly within what they're comfortable with, the primary residence regulations. I think there are a variable of different factors. So I'd be curious if there is a way to see like how many accounts that are actually accruing some sort of number, like in, I guess the active part was the hard thing to say there, but I think we could see maybe that these numbers were closer, because I'm curious, what is the story we're trying to say here? If there's a difference of 1,000 licenses to tax accounts, I'm curious, like, what is this data telling me? I guess would be maybe my question here.
Yeah, that's a great question. And the individual account level data is always tricky, and the level of detail I can give you is tricky because of taxpayer confidential sections of our ordinance. But I know that there are accounts that just file a net zero tax due and say that they're probably using a licensed provider like Airbnb who's licensed with us to remit their tax. And then there are accounts that file monthly and quarterly, but the majority of the accounts are probably on an annual basis. So I don't know if they're active or not until January of 2021.
Great, thank you.
You're welcome.
Great. Okay. I don't see any other questions in the chat, so we will move on. Feel free to jump in if you do have a question. So the next area we'll go into is current events. This is kind of, I know everyone knows what is going on currently, but we always do include it. So I wanted to add a few stories here. The big news, I think, pertinent here for Colorado and especially Denver is that short-term rentals in Colorado are allowed to resume business. So during the state's stay-at-home and safer-at-home orders, previously short-term rentals were not permitted to operate, but that is no longer the case as of June 1st. So I've linked to a story about that. That said, one thing that I did find interesting is that in reading about the effect of the pandemic in other jurisdictions, what we're starting to see is that short-term rental hosts that have multiple properties have been hit harder during the coronavirus. So in places that they don't have a primary residence, we've seen a lot of stories talking about folks who have had to the bills with the decreased income from restricted travel. So that's an interesting issue that we seem to have avoided a bit here in Denver. So you can read more about that. What else did we see? Airbnb, as I'm sure a lot of you are aware, laid off about a quarter of its staff, which is a big blow to the short-term rental industry. You can read about that with a statement from the CEO. And finally, some good news. Recently, what we're seeing with several states lifting public health orders or amending the restrictions on travel, vacation bookings are up from the same point of this week last year. So you can read about that as well. Did anyone else have any major topics that they've read about and want to share here? Or if not, we'll move on.
One thing that I thought was interesting is that the average length of stay over the last couple months has doubled, like worldwide, on the Airbnb platform.
And that's David. David, where did you see that reported?
I think it was from probably a press release from Airbnb, but I read it a month ago, so I couldn't be 100%. Okay.
If I find it, I'll send it around. Oh, and Dana has an update too. Dana, would you like to go next?
Sure. Another thing that I knew was happening on a more like a countrywide global level is that because of the safety and lower touch points and private access, keyless entry that short-term rentals provide, that a lot of people were opening up their homes for people that were first responders and on the front line, or possibly a medical professional that needed to kind of isolate away from their family if they were in a high contagious area. So it was nice to see the industry be able to step in a way where a lot of us felt like we were with our hands tied at home, told to stay in. I know in a lot of areas they were able to open their homes to those in need.
Awesome. Well, if either of you find a link that you'd like to send around, feel free to shoot that to me and I'll include it with, the next update that goes around to the committee. So thank you for sharing those. All right, so next we have a new contact with Airbnb. I believe she's on the call. Aisha, would you like to?
Yeah.
Hi.
Hi, my name is Aisha. I'm on the policy team. I'm here with my colleague, Matt Middlebrook. He'll kick us off and then he'll pass it to me, and we're excited to share some updates, but we're excited to be on our first STRAC call and looking forward to working more closely with you all.
Awesome, we're glad to have you and welcome to the group.
Thank you.
Hi all, this is Matt Middlebrook, as Aisha said. I've been with Airbnb nearly 4 years now. I've managed policy for much of the big chunks of the Western United States, including California and with jurisdictions in Hawaii and Los Angeles and San Francisco, and which is obviously our headquarters city. And with some of our changes around the company, we've rejiggled some of the jurisdictions, and now I oversee all of the Western United States, everything from Kansas sort of all the way out to Hawaii. And Aisha is on our team. We've got a a great team of policy leaders, and Aisha will be your primary point of contact going forward. But I'll be closely involved in all of this stuff, as I have been in a lot of our key jurisdictions. Denver clearly is an important one of the places where we first got a regulatory framework in place that's seems to be clearly working well. And so we are here to continue to be a resource and partner with you guys going forward. So look forward to working with you all. And so I'll turn back over to Aisha for a few minutes to give a little more of an update.
Yeah, thank you so much, Matt. Again, super excited to be with you all. Figured it might be worth just sharing what we've been up to these last few months. I know we've all been navigating new normals, taking care of children and schooling and all of that stuff on our end. We did see travel slow down significantly as we navigated the response to COVID-19 on our end. We wanted to think about how can we work with our hosts to really provide housing for those most in need. And the two groups we focused on across the country and really across the world were, number one, first responders. So we primarily worked with hospital systems and city and state governments across the country. And two, we started to dip our toes into the domestic violence space. We heard directly from providers and cities that with domestic violence survivors really trapped at home with their abusers, everyone's kind of anticipating a huge rush to hotlines. And so we've started putting all of those in place. As cities and states start opening back up, can we put some infrastructure in place? And so we launched and are currently working on a few domestic violence partnerships that you will be hearing more about soon. And then the second piece really is, how do we reopen safely? How do we give cities and states the tools they need to reopen safely? And so just yesterday, for those of you who are on the Airbnb platform, we announced our enhanced cleaning protocol, which was developed in partnership with leading experts in hospitality and the medical hygiene space. That protocol is now available to hosts across the US and other countries, and includes a 5-step cleaning process, room by room checklist. There's a 28-page guide our office put together, which we'll be sending along to you all after the STRAC meeting. So again, thinking about, as we're reopening, as tourism starts to kick back up, how do families do so safely? And how do we keep the communities we operate in really, really safe? And then finally, just as we're thinking about our work together moving forward, we are all navigating new normals. The tourism industry is navigating something it's never been through before, but how do we think about being really strong partners with you all in this work? I know the last time we all spoke, we talked about the MOU route and how that wasn't a viable route. And so at this point, we want to work with you to figure out what an amenable solution is. And so I think an ordinance was raised, and we're supportive of working with you all on that and seeing where our conversations lead. And with that, Matt and I are happy to take any questions or just share more about ourselves, whatever's most appropriate.
I should have also mentioned that my daughter is headed to the University of Colorado at Boulder in the fall for her freshman year. So I'll be a frequent visitor to Colorado, where my brother is actually also a paramedic on your in your department there.
Okay, Erica?
Yes.
George Mail?
Hi, George.
Yes. Please get the contact information for Matt and Aisha, so that we, if we need to get a hold of them, we'll have it. And I guess I'll welcome you two to the STRAC committee. And I'm George Mail, president of the neighborhood organizations here in Denver. Thank you.
Nice.
Awesome. Really great to meet you, George.
We can't hear you, Erica, if you're...
I'm so sorry. You think I'd know how to do this by now. I said I will share the information, the contact info with everybody so that you have an updated roster. And then that way you have that, George. Does anyone else have any other questions for Airbnb? Okay, hearing none. I'll keep monitoring the. Oh,
I have my hand raised. I don't know if you can see that or not.
oh, sorry, I missed that. Go ahead.
Thank you. This is Councilman Flynn. I thought George was going to ask this, and I apologize if I missed it because there's a lot of distractions here while working from home with everything else that's going on in the city. But what is the status of the request that Airbnb remove listings in Denver that do not display the license number?
So this is Matt. Councilman, nice to meet you at least over a virtual call. I know that request has been made. If we take down listings, they simply migrate to another platform. If we did that unilaterally and would not help you achieve your enforcement goals, it would probably make them worse. We've seen this in other jurisdictions. We've had this in New Orleans, where we took a number of voluntary steps at the city's request to put things to take some enforcement steps, which we did unilaterally. Listings migrated to other platforms where other platforms were not cooperative, and ironically, then we having been in voluntary compliance became even under more criticism because people tend to associate short-term rentals with Airbnb. For good or bad, our branding has now sort of like applies exactly, or Kleenex or Frisbee or whatever, right? So it's the good and the bad, and so even though we are in compliance, short-term rentals and thus Airbnb were under criticism in New Orleans, just because one of us took a step and others didn't. So two things. When we talked about doing the MOU and agreeing to a notice and takedown format, we wanted to do that and have it apply across platforms. I know that was not something, that those discussions preceded me, but I know that they, did not advance. And so, what we think would be the most useful thing for, to achieve the level of sort of stability and compliance and across the board compliance that we think works best is to move forward with like an ordinance that would put in place the requirements that, if the city notifies us of illegal, any platform that, that they're then taken down. So we have an across the board uniform compliance system that is, brings everybody into compliance and, and helps you achieve your goals, because one unilateral voluntary compliance by one player, even if we're dominant, is not going to get us there. And so that's what Aisha was alluding to, and we'd love to work with you on achieving sort of legislatively the things that we talked about in an MOU to get you to where you want to go. I mean, it's impressive. I mean, 85% compliance. I actually had I had questions about your first slide because I didn't, in terms of those numbers. I mean, that's a pretty it's an effective system you have in place. I mean, 85% compliance is really high. I would suspect that most of your ordinances don't have that level of compliance. So it seems that the system is working, but if we can step that up some, we want to work with you towards that goal through an ordinance in the weeks and months going forward.
Sure. All right, thank you. Now, some of that 85%, of course, is due to the decline in the number of non-compliant ones also.
No, unquestionably, but still, I think
and because probably
you were still looking at like, if you go back to that first slide, you were still looking at like what 77 or 78% compliance pre-COVID, which is still a really high.
Yes, it is. And And I congratulate our staff on achieving that too. Thank you.
No, and listen, I cite Denver and other jurisdictions that we talk about because, you know, what you guys did right is that you created, a lot of jurisdictions think that they have to, make these registration processes so difficult and the bar high and get all, you went the other direction and made it a relatively easy process because the benefit to the city is getting people into the system. So then you can have compliance. And, I think with the way you've handled it is exactly right. It's borne out by the level of compliance, and hopefully we can, work collaboratively to push that up a little bit higher. But we're happy and willing to do that.
Thank you.
Thanks, Kevin, for bringing that up. This is George. I must be getting old because I forgot my normal spiel. But Matt, we're looking for 100%. Thank you.
See, I was stunned, George, when you didn't do that. That's why I had to unmute myself and speak up. Thank you. You're losing it. You're getting behind.
Sounds like we are all supporting each other and helping each other out. So I see Buffy asked some questions in the chat. Buffy, did Matt's description answer the questions that you had?
Yes, my questions have been answered. It was the same thing we were talking about then. I wondered what the ordinance was, but
Okay.
I see that.
All right. Awesome. Great. And Chris also put in the chat, and I'll send it around with the contact info. But Chris, do you want to talk about the link you shared?
I have shared two at this point. The first one was just the guidelines, requirements from the State Department of Health about how to operate a short-term rental. That information is certainly for hosts and for guests too. It applies to both. So if that's helpful, or if anybody who's a host or needs to go out to anyone else from here, please feel free to use it. And then the second link I posted was a direct link to our ordinance about the listing of license numbers on advertisements, if that's helpful for discussion.
Great. Thank you for sharing those resources. I'll make sure to send them around too for the folks who are dialing in on the phone and can't see the chat. Does anyone else have any questions for Airbnb at this juncture? If not, we'll move on.
Erica, it's Councilwoman Sawyer. Not a question for Airbnb, but I think maybe just a question for excise staff, given the Airbnb conversation and how much is going on around, so many of the other priorities that, excise and license have for the year, and some of the other stated priorities that Airbnb and our short-term rental advisory committee priorities had discussed for the year. If we've got to look at laying out an ordinance now because Airbnb is not willing to discuss an MOU with us, what is that going to do to our other priorities?
I would just.
I'm sorry, I was in the middle of a sentence, so could you let me finish my idea before you interrupt me, please? So if an MOU isn't something that's going to be done, what is that going to do for our other priorities in the conversation, of the things that we wanted to hopefully achieve for the year? Have you thought about that? And if so, is that a conversation we need to have with the rest of the advisory committee on what that's going to look like and what we might need to reprioritize over the course of the year? Thanks so much.
Sure.
Can I respond just real quick?
In just a second, Matt. In just a second, because I do think that's actually a really good segue into the last item we have on our agenda. So maybe as we discuss this as part of the goal setting, you can kind of chime in with your thoughts, because the next thing.
First, let me apologize to Councilmember for cutting her off. I thought she was done, so I apologize for that. We're happy to talk about an MOU. If that's a preferred path, I just want to make it clear. We are happy to talk about an MOU. We thought that the city had seemed reluctant on those conversations. If that is a path that you want to pursue and not an ordinance, we are more than willing to have those conversations too. So just in the terms of the various options, there's no unwillingness on our part to talk about that.
I
everybody. This is Molly Dupleshin. I haven't chimed in yet, but so Matt and Aisha, it's nice to meet you. I'm the Deputy Director of Policy for the Denver Excise and Licenses Department. And so we are excited. You are now on the team and looking forward to starting to work with you. And I think we'll probably plan some time in the next couple of weeks to kind of get up to speed with each other. But just to take everybody back in the time machine from 4 months ago, pre all of this. So that was kind of the discussions that happened really in the first couple months of the year. Was we had some conversations with Airbnb about an MOU and kind of got to a point where we decided that wasn't the best path to take, and decided that an ordinance was probably a better route to take, and so had started on working on that kind of right before all of this started. But we're still finalizing the primary residence changes that got adopted in March. So really we are closing that out and just launching, just a second, sorry, launching that right as soon as all of this started. So I think we're going to kind of revisit those. And to your question about priorities, Councilwoman, I think that's the conversation that we're going to have, I think, for the rest of this meeting today, and making sure that we do have the kind of workforce and strength and capacity to take this on, but we think it's a pretty priority issue, and we would like to kind of see that consistency across the platforms and require that compliance to remove listings or take down listings if we find that they're unlicensed. So we agree that there is value in that consistency, applying that across all platforms.
Great, thank you so much, Molly.
Thanks, Molly, for bringing that up, George.
Yep.
Okay, great. Thank you, everybody. So this is where I want to spend the big chunk of our time. Because we don't have a typical public comment setting, it gives us a little bit more time to dig into this conversation. When we had met in February, you all asked me to take a look at this slide that I put together that lists our 3 core values and some goals that align with each. And we had talked about adding, order of priority, timeline, information like that. However, with everything that's happened over the last few months, everything that's changed, we thought it would be more pertinent to have a really robust discussion with all the members of the committee, including our new members, about these 3 core values and what goals are really at the top of our priority list, knowing that we have a changed landscape for our industry and for our guests and for our Denver residents with everything related to the pandemic. We also have some city budget shortfalls. So every single department in the city is looking to make up budget gaps from reduced revenue from this year and probably in the next couple of years moving forward. So knowing that we, might not have the same resources that we have been used to having in the last few years. So really looking at what our top priorities really are. And then thinking about what will have the biggest impact on health, safety, and welfare. So with that, I will open the floor for anyone who wants to discuss, what you think a burning priority should be, any of the tasks that you think can wait. Are there any new tasks that we have? I put together actually some questions on the next slide, but do we have new priorities? Do we have changed priorities? What new action items should we pursue? Which goals are still, oh no, see, I can't go back. I'm sorry. Which goals are still incredibly relevant with a changed landscape. So like I said, I'd like to open it up to everybody to add your comments and feedback on moving forward.
This is George again. On the very first one, protecting the fabric and character of the neighborhoods. The primary resident rule is fixed in concrete, and for anyone to do business in Denver, that will never change. So let's just make that known right now. Thank you.
This is David Pardo. I think that the highest priority needs to really be ensuring that we're raising as much tax revenue as possible, given this upcoming budget shortfall that may extend into 2021 or even 2022. So I know for me as an operator, our tax revenue has fallen significantly, and it's actually fallen much more significantly even than our bookings, because a lot of our bookings are getting 30+ day stays, which don't pay a lodger's tax per current Denver law. And so I know that's contributing to that underlying shortfall. So I just wanted to bring that up.
Great, thank you.
So David, can you clarify, this is Molly Dupleshain, can you clarify that? What are you proposing?
I'm not proposing anything in particular. I just wanted to, that hospitality, and it's not just short-term rentals. I mean, my friends who run hotels are looking at, 90% drops in revenue. I don't know what the answer to it is, but I know that last year, obviously from just extrapolating from the numbers on slide, whatever it was for, the hospitality industry brought in over $100 million to the city of Denver last year. And in all likelihood, we're going to contribute, like half that. And that's Airbnbs, bed and breakfasts, hotels, and anything that we can do to increase that, which may not fall within STRAC. It may fall under supporting Visit Denver, but I think it's critical so that our teachers get paid and things like that.
If I can add something to what David just said, in my experience, I'm here in this group as a property management company, but also as a founding member of the Mile High Advocacy Group, which has close to 350 hosts within our community. And some of the stories that we're hearing right now are things about people having their affidavit with 52 pending renewals being approved there. And I totally get with the world turning sideways and everything that's on your plate and budgetary cuts and all of that, if we can be mindful of I know it's not intentional, but being mindful of allowing people to operate their short-term rental now that the ban has been lifted, and allowing them to get bookings in and allowing them to bring money into their pockets, as well as paying their cleaners, as well as having their guests go to the businesses that are desperately seeking people to come and spend money, where they, 50% of them are very likely going to be going out of business. I think we need to be doing everything we can to allow people that are rule abiding to continue to operate their property within the law. I think that with the primary residence law, I think we need to be mindful of what it is that we are trying to protect and hold sacred when we created that law. And I think sometimes it's easy to get caught in the minutia of counting a certain number of days or, someone's unique lifestyle that may present them with an opportunity to take their kids and travel throughout Europe when their husband or their partner is a flight attendant. And I am hearing these stories about people being denied their license and their license then expiring, and then they don't have the ability to continue to offer their home in a way that allows them to come back to that space. And so if we could just keep in mind that part of the reason for the primary residence, one of the factors in the reason primary residence is so we don't have investors going in and buying up every other home. I know there's a handful of other reasons, but if we see a unique scenario, and part of this new language that was added to the ordinance was to say, we're going to judge every unique scenario separately. It's not some black and white term because that's what the hosting community asked for. We didn't want 183 days. So we have to judge each case individually. But my ask would be that we put value on looking at that unique situation and saying, is this an investor type? Are they being a nuisance? Do they need to have better counseling on what the issue is with their neighborhood? Do they need to have, some of those difficult conversations, and keeping in mind, let's keep the tax revenue coming into the city and into our mom and pop businesses, into our coffee shops. So kind of just picking back off of what David had shared. Thank you.
I understand what you just said, but let's kind of keep our eye on the ball. You mentioned the tax revenue that comes in from the visitors tax, et cetera. But let's keep our eye on the ball. The taxpayers, the city, the people that own their properties are what keeps this city going. Make no mistake. So when a property owner and a person that lives in their house, that's who's funding everything for the most part. So that's why there is a primary resident rule to keep that neighborhood viable. So that's the crux of it. And so, as I said, that's fine. We're not going to ever put that on the table. That's in concrete. Okay.
So thanks everyone for your comments. Maybe looking at each of the values, I know that pursuing the primary residence language that passed was crucial to value 1 and value 2. But we have a lot of goals under supporting our compliant host community and keeping pace with evolution. Our Deputy Director of Operations has told us several times, let's not waste a good pandemic opportunity to improve. You know, does anyone have any recommendations for, you know, any of the tasks that we have listed here that are especially important as we move to, you know, some more digital and virtual times? Anything that you've seen helpful in other settings that, you know, you'd like to share? Anything like that? No? Okay. I don't see any comments. Buffy, you had a question. Do you want to elaborate?
Oh, no, I had just made, and I can't type on this thing. It's really embarrassing to have my information out there where it doesn't make any sense. But I just wanted to make the point that the requirement for the primary residence is also really important for supporting the compliant host community. Because when you have people out there who aren't complying and we're competing against them, the more compliant ones, then that puts us at a disadvantage, it seems like.
Okay.
I just wanted to make that point, and I do think it's really important.
Thank you. So one thing that we've talked about, and maybe if we focus on a couple of specific things, we'll get a better idea. We've talked a little bit about working with Airbnb and other platforms on the next phase of the policy recommendations from this group, which includes an ordinance to adopt requirements for platforms to increase accountability and add some regulation for a different player. Does anyone have any thoughts on, you know, where that priority falls in relation to our work? Is that still a top priority for everybody? Does it change at all, or is it still, you know, at the top of the list?
This is David speaking again. To me, I think it's still an important priority. At the same time, I think that it being the #1 priority might be wrong given the current setting. The current state of the world. I think that if you'd asked that question 3 months ago or 4 months ago, the answer would have been yes, that's absolutely our #1 priority going forward. And right now, I still think it's important, but I don't know if that's the most important thing that we can possibly do with our time.
Okay, we have a question from Daniel. Daniel, do you want to pose the question to the group?
Yeah, thanks. I'm new here, and I'm sensing that there's a lot of pre-existing back and forth with Airbnb from committee members, and I understand a lot of that, and very familiar with issues that I've seen in other cities. But I just was curious, you know, I'd love to hear from some of the committee members and maybe from Airbnb too. What does this committee most want Airbnb to do that it doesn't do already? Are there hot issues out there? Sounded like there might be, but I just wasn't familiar with those.
So I'll start that one, and other committee members can chime in. But essentially, when we look at the data from the beginning of the slides, we have that gap between the number of licensed properties, and the number of properties that are advertising. So we've got some properties that are advertising who do not have the required license. One tool that would make enforcement a lot easier for us as a city would be a mandatory field from the platform indicating that you can't post your advertisement until you've put in a license number. And then what we would do as the city is we would check those numbers to make sure that they're valid and that they're, active. But if we don't have a number at all, it's a lot harder to identify the person who's violating that piece of our law. So that was one thing that we've asked for. The other piece is then if we do find advertisements that do not have a valid license number or don't have a license number at all in their advertisement, that those be removed. So those are the two basic things that we've asked, and I'll let anyone else chime in if they have additional comments.
Erica?
Yes.
Isn't it true that other platforms have complied and they do take down sites that do not have a license number, a Denver license number on them?
That might be a good question for Alex. Alex, do you know the answer to that, or Molly?
I think Booking.com is the only one that I'm aware of that has removed listings.
So VRBO didn't make a gentleman's agreement with us?
No, they have not.
Okay.
And can I, this is Dan, sorry to jump in, but the if Airbnb is still on the line, I just love a succinct thought on that.
On what the?
I'd say mandatory field.
Yeah, and so again, this is we actually had an MOU that we were discussing with the city to do that, but again, we don't. If only one platform is compliant, it doesn't achieve the goals because people will just migrate to Booking or to VRBO. And by the way, I'd be interested to know if and shocked if Booking did take down listings because they typically are loath to participate in these types of agreements. So I'd be interested to know if in Denver that was different. And so we are interested in working with the city, as I was stating earlier, to either through an MOU, which we suggested, but if that's not the course the city wants to take, and an ordinance is better, to come up with a compliance system that applies to all platforms, we are happy to work with the city to do that. But we think that it needs to be a structure that captures all players, or you're just not going to achieve what you want to achieve.
Does that answer your questions, Daniel?
Those are helpful to me understanding this issue. Yes.
Great. Does anyone else have any thoughts? I see Buffy indicated that she believes it's still top of the list. Does anyone else have?
I have a question too. Do we have any incentives for hosts and platforms to comply with this? I mean, are there any significant fines involved, especially if platforms are leaving the the things that aren't compliant on their platforms?
So I think this is Molly again. I mean, we've got the requirement that Chris had posted earlier that requires hosts to include their license number on their advertisement. But anything beyond that is what we would be looking at in this ordinance that we're talking about.
So the ordinance would impose penalties for platforms if they were listing things that didn't have a license.
We still need to figure out what all of that would look like, and that would all happen in the drafting. And so hopefully we can turn some attention to that over the next couple of months and be working with all of you and Airbnb and the other platforms to get to a good place on what that language might look like. But I mean, that would be the point of the ordinance, is to be able to kind of have some enforcement mechanisms behind that, because it's already required, right, that you have a license and that you include the license number on your listing.
Right.
So
And you can get in trouble with the city if you're a host and you're doing that, right? If you're not compliant. Where you can get reported by neighbors or?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, we issue citations all the time for hosts that don't have a license or that don't have their license number in their advertisement.
Right. But right now there's no penalty for platforms.
Yeah, an ordinance would clarify that the platforms would be required to take that on.
Okay.
It looks like we've got a question from Michael. Michael, you want to take the stage?
Sure thing. Thanks, Erica. Hi, everybody. Michael Murphy here. I have a question for Matt with Airbnb. First, Matt, thanks for being on this call. Appreciate it, and appreciate the explanation you provided as well. That was one of the better explanations I believe the committee has ever received from Airbnb. But my question for you is this, even with your explanation, why not be a good partner with the city of Denver and take those listings down? What I'm hearing and what I'm reading between the lines is that Airbnb would rather keep those listings up and make more money rather than doing what's required by Denver's laws and taking them down. I think we all know on this call that Airbnb is the primary platform that's used by short-term renters in Denver. I think it would actually create, there'd be an actual impact. There would be a meaningful effect if Airbnb was a leader and was a good partner and voluntarily took those listings down rather than waiting for the city to have to come up with some kind of ordinance change. I wonder how you would respond to that. It just, to me, I sense Airbnb not being a good partner and just wanting to make money. How would you respond to that?
Appreciate that, Michael. I understand the concern. I think I discussed a little bit about it when I first addressed this, but happy to reiterate a couple things. One, a city that has a system that has 85% compliance is, there's, again, I suspect that there are a few other laws in place in Denver that have 85% compliance. That's a very high compliance rate. And so the law and the system that you have in place are working well. Always room for improvement, granted. Second, if we voluntarily took them down, they would migrate to other platforms. Like I mentioned before, in New Orleans, we did that. They migrated to other platforms. People were just as frustrated, if not more frustrated at that point, and ended up passing an ordinance anyway to address the problem. Well, we got beat up along the way because we're emblematic of the industry, even though we had voluntarily complied. And so what we believe is important for both for the city to achieve its goals is to create a framework where all partners are compliant. I mean, we're all folks in the industry are compliant. We were working with the city to try and to be a good partner and working on an MOU to come up with this framework. It does not appear to be the path that the city wanted to go down. And so we are here today to say we are happy to engage directly with the city to work together on an ordinance to create a framework to get all competitors in the pool, because absent something that catches all competitors, you will not solve the problem.
As a host, I second what Airbnb is saying. I really don't think that that Airbnb complying and not watching, most critically VRBO, also comply. I think the other 100 platforms out there matter a little bit less. But if Airbnb complies and VRBO does not, my expectation is that our most problematic actors would no longer be under the purview of our most useful ally when it comes to platforms. It would move to another platform with which the city has less of a relationship and has had less communication.
I feel like Airbnb has a bit more responsibility than other platforms because it is the largest and most used one. And also because some members of this committee have really worked hard with Airbnb. It's different people have been sent to the city to work with the city. And it's been always, well, it's on the horizon, it's on the horizon, it's on the horizon. And it's like this constant delaying. And so it seems like we need to go forward, but I do feel like Airbnb could take a leadership role on this.
So thanks everyone for your comments. I know there's several people I haven't heard from at all today. So if you haven't spoken up and you have any good thoughts on where work on this ordinance falls on your priority list, that would be great. You could also email Molly or I after the meeting if you have more thoughts and you want to write them down rather than speak them right now. But if anyone has any more comments on where to put this as a priority, I'd love to hear that.
Erica?
Yes?
This is Cindy.
Hi, Cindy.
I think that is a priority, and especially for all platforms. And I do wish Airbnb would take the lead on it. Others, I think, would follow. I don't think we're necessarily like New Orleans here. But the other thing that I'd like to say that I think is very important is the property management requirements for compliance. I think that should follow right after if we have to do an ordinance. If Airbnb won't comply and be a leader, then I think this is also something we need to do because our property management teams need to have requirements to follow the same guidelines and not have any of their clients not be licensed. So I think it should be treated as a realty licensed company that would manage short-term rentals. And that's all.
Great, thank you for your comment. I see that Councilman Flynn and then Charlotte have their hands raised, so let's go in that order.
I think I just forgot to put it down.
Oh.
Blood was draining out of my arm. That explains it. Thank you.
Okay, great. Charlotte then? Oh, we can't hear Charlotte.
Forgot to unmute.
That's okay.
We started out discussing how important are the 4 compliance requirements, and I think our E&L has been done a very good job of trying to stay on top of those and making good progress, and they should never drop down to a lower level of importance. Cindy made a good comment right now about suggesting that property managers actually have licensing requirements as well. I could support that 100%. The ordinance, I think maybe we need to start getting serious about it. It's we're just going to need something to get this whole process better regulated. That's about it.
Great, thank you. So we've got about 10 more minutes left on the phone call. So I want to make sure that we talk about any other things that you all feel are important. Some things that I thought that I remember being important prior to everyone going into stay at home was some of that education around different property configurations, and then risks and opportunities with emerging lodging models. So we have one of our new members is actually with Daydream. So I didn't know if we wanted to talk about either of those things or if anyone had any thoughts. I think what we've seen is that there will be a little bit less of an issue with things like party houses and the DPD roundtable, which was a really good idea, but with reduced numbers of travel, I'm not sure those are top priority, but if anyone has any different thoughts, I'll open the floor.
I think getting clarification about things like ADUs versus duplexes. I know I've definitely dealt with clients who don't, whether they're building an ADU but they're in a duplex zone. Things get complicated, and I think it would still be of significant value, whether at the next meeting or whenever we can actually meet in person and the public can ask questions after the fact. Getting clarification, I think that's really, really useful. Also, I just wanted to mention, as a property manager, I'm all for writing up some sort of rule standardization for what it means to be a property manager. And also wanted to mention that every property I've ever managed has always had a valid license at the time at which I took them on as clients.
Thank you, David. Does anyone else have any other thoughts on, looks like Dana has a comment.
No, I was just going to echo what David said, that at the company that I'm a part of, we take great pride in making sure that our clients are all licensed. We won't even onboard their property into management until they provide us that license and that they're within compliance. So, yeah, I definitely understand there may be some, question marks there on whether that happens or if they're part of the problem or facilitating these illegal listings. But our community that we've created of property managers joining together, it is one of our golden rules that we require us to be upholding the licensure requirement.
And we appreciate the work that you both do in that regard. Thank you for that. Dana, as a property manager, do you have any thoughts on that education on ADUs and duplexes and the importance or significance of that as a priority?
I think that's really important. I spoke to somebody just the other day that did not know she couldn't live, and she was looking to have us manage her property. She just was not wanting to have all that back and forth on her plate anymore, and she was looking to live in her back unit and rent out her front unit. And I told her that that wasn't allowed, and she looked high and low and said, I don't see that anywhere. And I sent her over a document that I was forwarded. And so I think there is definitely an opportunity to provide more education so that people understand if they're operating in a way that they shouldn't be.
Great, thank you.
Hi, this is Erin. I don't have the hand raising capability because I did the old school dial in. But wanted to kind of dovetail on a few of the other comments that committee members have made, that I think an 85% compliance rate is pretty darn good, and it would be curious to see how that compares to other home business uses, but acknowledging that certainly short-term rentals can have a vastly larger impact on neighbors than, somebody cutting hair in their basement or something of that nature. And so I'm not sure I necessarily feel that the ordinance should be our highest priority, but I do think it's reasonable that platforms are in compliance with Denver law. And so I feel like it would make sense for us to pursue what that would look like so that all vendors that perhaps join this platform sharing world when it comes to STRs or others, that similarly to how the city pursued a more sweeping ordinance that acknowledged the revenue collection relationship, that it would be applied to all players as opposed to just negotiating an agreement with Airbnb, that it's appropriate to take that same step. And certainly, yes, it would be nice for Airbnb to take the lead, but if you're just turning up the heat and opening the windows and you're just having seepage of people going to different platforms, not so sure whether that is such a critical step for us at this point. But I do think from a day-to-day logistical, the environment of Denver and how we operate perspective, that certainly having the clarity in terms of property structure of ADU versus basement apartment versus duplex, that I've had so many conversations with my neighbors, and the lack of clarity around that should really be addressed. And that falls lockstep with how much work we've put into the licensing process in general of like, let's make this understandable to people so that they know what they're doing, how to operate, so that they are given the benefit of the doubt in an environment that encourages, enables them to operate properly and legally. And so I think that to me, that as well as the education and the exchange with hosts of how to be a good host, how to be a good property manager, that those things are where the rubber hits the road with regards to influence on neighbors and giving people the opportunity to learn how to do this right. We've been doing a great job in ferreting out bad players and, yanking license or issuing administrative citations. And so I feel like the progress there is really great. And so I'm less interested in drawing a line in the sand and saying it's got to be 100%. I'm always going to go for 100%. I'm more interested in seeing the tangible elements that create a functional business environment and functional neighborhood fabric environment for STRs going forward. And I think we see the biggest benefits from that in some of the softer regulation and educational approaches.
I wanted to mention, I second all of that, specifically education for hosts. Brian had actually asked me, I believe it was in late February, if I had any resources that I could share with him for new hosts. He was hoping for some sort of document, and I spent an afternoon standing up a brand new website that I then sent him the URL for so that he could share it with all new hosts who ever had questions about best practices for hosting, and made that available to the public at large and gave him direct access so that he could share it. And that was one afternoon. Like there's a lot more that can be done, but it sort of needs to be a communal effort.
Great. Well, we've got about 2 minutes left, so we'll start wrapping up the conversation. But thank you all for your great feedback and thoughts. I wasn't sure what the priorities would be in the changed world, but it sounds like the top two are pursuing that ordinance and that education around different configurations. Those seem to be really valuable to a lot of people. If anyone else has any additional comments, feel free to, as always, reach out and we will, consider that. But I just want to close out the meeting by thanking everyone who might have been watching along at home. We do have 3 more scheduled meetings for the year in August, October, and December. This meeting is our first virtual meeting, so I think it went pretty well. Thank you everyone for participating. If you have any suggestions for how to improve, I am 100% open to feedback. So we are all, I think, just trying to do the best we can. But public comment, if anyone watching along at home wants to submit a public comment, typically at the end of the meeting, we would allow you to come speak, address the committee, and other members of the audience would be able to hear as well. Since we can't do that here, you can submit your comments to str@denvergov.org. As always, all written comments will be shared with the committee, but if you'd like your comment to be posted on our STRAC website for that public viewing, just make sure that you get it to us by June 30th, and we'll include a packet of any comments we received. Once we get this recording to our tech services, who will create a link, we'll send out a bulletin that will publish it, so feel free to forward that, share with anyone you know who usually likes to come to these meetings. It'll be on our STRAC website. And we will continue to communicate through that bulletin. So if you're not signed up for that, you can do that on our short-term rental webpage at denvergov.org. Thanks to everybody. Does anyone have any other closing thoughts before I end the meeting?
Erica, I had my hand raised, and I'm sorry I raised it like 3 minutes before the end of the meeting. But when you highlighted the 2 primary areas in the values section in part 3, the one area that I think Aaron hit on very well is sort of the clarity around these different housing types. But you also had as a bullet emerging models, which I think is very important for us to think about in the future, and maybe something applicable and appropriate for the August meeting. The only thing that wasn't said as expressly that I think is really important is how we think about the way we view the different types of housing structures going forward. As an example, as ADUs become so much more pervasive over time in Denver and are being encouraged by neighborhoods, are we keeping pace with the thinking around the way those are used and the alignment with zoning? So I think that's a topic that we just need to wrestle with as a STRAC team. And so whatever the right way to go about doing that is, if you make that a more granular objective or it's something that we can table in a future meeting, I really think that warrants more dialogue than just, you know, how we execute what's already in place, which I think is important, but it's the future kind of looking view that I think we also need to balance our time on. So I guess that's the only other comment I would make.
Wonderful. Thank you, Susan. All right, with that, I will let everyone go. Thank you so much for your time. If you have any additional thoughts or questions, as always, feel free to reach out. Have a great evening, everybody.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Great job. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.